Before this story begins, one small request. If you love uncovering the hidden truths of history, hit like, drop a comment, share this video, and subscribe to the channel right now. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to be told. What if I told you, during World War II, while millions were dying, bombs were falling across Europe, and the world was split between democracy and fascism, the United States of America and the Vatican were secretly talking, sharing intelligence, moving money, and negotiating power behind closed doors. No official treaty, no public announcement, no headlines, just shadows, silence, and a secret agreement that changed history forever. In the winter of 1941, Rome was a city holding its breath. German troops marched through Europe like a dark tide. Mussolini's Italy stood as Hitler's closest ally. The Vatican, an independent city-state no larger than a neighborhood, sat trapped in the middle of a fascist empire. Officially, the Holy See was neutral. Unofficially, it was one of the most powerful intelligence hubs in the world. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Pope Pius XII, born Eugenio Pacelli, paced quietly across marble floors. To the public, he was a spiritual leader. To the Axis powers, he was a diplomatic puzzle. And to the Allies, especially the United States, he was something far more dangerous, a man who knew everything. Pacelli had served as papal nuncio to Germany. He spoke fluent German. He personally knew high-ranking Nazi officials, and through priests, bishops, nuns, and missionaries scattered across Europe, the Vatican had eyes and ears in places no government could reach. The United States understood this very well, but here was the problem. America had no formal diplomatic relation with the Vatican. Since the 19th century, political pressure from Protestant groups had blocked official ties, yet Franklin Roosevelt, facing a global war, did not care about old taboos. He cared about intelligence. In 1940, before America even entered the war, Roosevelt made a bold, controversial move. He appointed Myron C. Taylor, a Protestant industrialist and trusted confidant, as his personal representative to Pope Pius XII. Not an ambassador, not a diplomat, something else, a messenger in the shadows. Taylor arrived in Rome under secrecy, no press conference, no public records. When he met the Pope, there were no flags, no photographs. But what happened in that room would shape the war. The Vatican agreed to quietly cooperate with the United States, not publicly, not officially, but practically. Through Vatican channels, information began to flow about German troop movements, internal resistance groups, and even assassination plots against Hitler himself. One of the earliest pieces of intelligence came from German officers who were secretly Catholic and anti-Nazi. They trusted the church more than any foreign power. Confessions became coded messages. Parish reports became intelligence briefs. These reports traveled from German dioceses to Rome, from Rome to Myron Taylor, from Taylor to Franklin Roosevelt, and from Roosevelt to Allied command. But intelligence was only one part of the agreement. Money was another. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, was one of the few financial institutions in Europe still operating across borders. While nations froze assets and collapsed currencies, Vatican accounts moved quietly through neutral channels. American funds, channeled through Catholic charities, were used to support underground resistance networks in Italy, France, and Eastern Europe. Some of these networks helped Jews escape Nazi territory. Others smuggled downed Allied pilots back to safety. None of it appeared in official U.S. budgets, none of it acknowledged by the Vatican, yet thousands survived because of it. But here lies the most controversial chapter. As the war intensified, reports of mass exterminations reached Rome. Jewish leaders begged Pope Pius XII to speak out publicly against Hitler. Roosevelt himself hinted that a papal condemnation could shake Catholic soldiers within the Axis armies.
But the Pope remained publicly silent. Why? Because behind closed doors, the Vatican and the United States had reached a grim understanding. A public denunciation, Vatican intelligence warned, could trigger brutal retaliation. Churches would be seized, priests executed, intelligence channels destroyed overnight. The Vatican would become blind. So instead of words, they chose shadows. While speeches were absent, actions multiplied. Catholic monasteries hid Jews under false identities. Vatican issued baptism certificates, saved thousands from deportation. Even within Rome itself, Jewish families were sheltered just meters from Nazi headquarters. The Vatican knew Rome would fall, and it did. In 1943, German troops occupied the city. Hitler reportedly considered kidnapping the Pope. The Vatican prepared secret evacuation plans, coordinated quietly with American intelligence. If the Pope were taken, the Catholic world could erupt. That never happened. By 1944, Allied forces liberated Rome. Vatican channels exploded with relief and a new urgency. Now came the post-war phase, and this is where the secret agreement took its darkest turn. As Nazi Germany collapsed, a new enemy arose: communism. The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. For the Vatican and the United States, this was unacceptable. Together, they shifted focus. Using Vatican ratlines, escape routes originally meant for refugees, some former Nazis were quietly moved out of Europe. The justification was strategic, preventing communist expansion by using anyone willing to fight it. This cooperation would later inspire the foundations of the CIA and Cold War intelligence operations. By the time the war officially ended, the secret partnership between Washington and the Vatican had already reshaped global power. No treaty was ever signed, no document publicly released, but the evidence remains, scattered across declassified files, private letters, and intelligence memos. A war within a war, a diplomacy without signatures, a pact written in silence. When Rome was liberated in June 1944, the war on the battlefield was ending, but the secret war between ideologies had already begun. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something most Americans did not yet realize. World War II was not truly about defeating Hitler alone. It was about deciding who would control the world afterward. And now, a new fear eclipsed all others: communism. The Soviet Red Army was sweeping across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, one by one, nations fell behind the Iron Curtain. For the Vatican, this was an existential threat. Communist ideology viewed religion not as an ally, but as an enemy to be erased. For the United States, it was a strategic nightmare. And so, the quiet alliance between Washington and the Holy See did not dissolve with Hitler's defeat. It evolved. Behind the scenes, American intelligence officers, many of them OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, continued meeting Vatican officials. The location was rarely the Apostolic Palace. Meetings happened in monasteries, diplomatic residences, even hospital chaplain offices. Why? Because now the objective was no longer information, it was containment. But containment required assets, and in post-war Europe, assets came with dirty pasts. Thousands of former Nazi officials, intelligence officers, scientists, and military specialists were suddenly fugitives. Some were wanted for war crimes. Others simply feared Soviet capture. Here is where the story turns deeply uncomfortable. The Vatican possessed something no other institution had: a global humanitarian network untouched by borders. Under the banner of helping displaced persons, millions of whom genuinely needed aid, escape routes emerged. These routes later became known as the ratlines. From Austria and Germany, through Italy to Spain, Argentina, and the Middle East. Officially, these routes helped refugees. Unofficially, they moved men with blood on their hands. The Vatican justified it as a moral dilemma. Better to let a former Nazi escape than allow a hardened communist regime to grow stronger. The United States quietly agreed. Declassified documents now confirmed that American intelligence agencies were aware of these movements. In some cases, they actively facilitated them. Why? Because many of these men had one thing the West desperately wanted: knowledge. German intelligence networks in Eastern Europe, anti-Soviet military experience, and in some cases, advanced scientific expertise. This was not unique to the Vatican partnership. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists directly to America. But the Vatican's role was subtler, quieter, and far harder to trace. Priests signed travel documents. Catholic charities provided shelter. Passports were issued under false identities. One of the most infamous beneficiaries was Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who later worked with U.S.-backed regimes in Latin America. Was this justice, or was it strategy? Inside the Vatican, the debate was fierce. Some clergy protested. Others argued the Church must survive at any cost. Pope Pius XII never publicly acknowledged the ratlines, but his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the United States moved fast. In 1947, the OSS officially transformed into the CIA. Many of its early Cold War tactics mirrored systems tested during the Vatican collaboration. Human intelligence networks, religious cover, non-governmental financial channels. The blueprint had already been written in wartime Rome. At the same time, the Vatican launched a spiritual counteroffensive. Catholic political parties received quiet support across Europe, especially in Italy. In the 1948 Italian election, the Church openly warned that voting communist endangered one's soul. Behind the sermons, American money flowed. The result? Italy stayed out of the communist bloc. This election alone convinced U.S. policymakers that religion could be a weapon, not just of faith, but of geopolitics. Yet the moral cost was immense. Jewish organizations later questioned why some perpetrators escaped justice. Historians still argue whether Pope Pius XII saved more lives through silence or lost moral authority by refusing condemnation. The Vatican archives from this period remain only partially open. Why? Because full transparency would reveal a truth many still cannot accept: that democracy, faith, and power do not always walk separate paths. By the early 1950s, the secret wartime agreement had faded into institutional memory. Myron Taylor stepped away. Roosevelt was dead. Pope Pius XII would die in 1958. But their shadow alliance lived on. In NATO strategies, in CIA operations, in Vatican diplomacy during the Cold War. World War II officially ended in 1945, but the secret war that began between the United States and the Vatican never truly did.
By the early 1950s, the world believed World War II was over. But inside intelligence circles, a different phrase was used: the war has changed form. The alliance between the United States and the Vatican no longer needed secret envoys like Myron Taylor. It had matured. It had institutional memory. And most importantly, it had a shared enemy: atheistic communism. For the Vatican, the threat was theological and existential. Churches were being closed in Eastern Europe. Priests were arrested. Bishops disappeared into labor camps. Religion itself was labeled a disease of the old world. For the United States, it was ideological warfare. If communism spread, democracy would collapse. And so the Cold War began, not with tanks, but with influence.
The CIA, newly formed in 1947, quietly studied wartime cooperation with the Vatican. Analysts noticed something remarkable. The Church could move information faster than embassies in places where American agents could never survive. Parishes existed behind the Iron Curtain. Confessionals gathered truths no interrogation could force. Missionaries crossed borders unnoticed. This was intelligence gold. Without ever signing an agreement, the CIA and the Vatican continued an unspoken understanding. Where American power could not reach, faith might. In Eastern Europe, priests became symbols of resistance. In Poland, a young bishop named Karol Wojtyła watched closely as communism crushed religious freedom. He remembered who stood against it and who did not. Decades later, the world would know him as Pope John Paul II. But before that future arrived, the past had to be buried. This is why Vatican archives matter. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, holds documents that span centuries. But when historians requested full access to World War II-era files, doors closed. Why? Because inside those files are records of back-channel communications with U.S. intelligence, financial transfers during covert operations, and decisions that traded moral clarity for strategic survival. When portions of the archives were finally opened, in stages starting in 2020, historians confirmed what many had suspected but could not fully prove. The Vatican was not neutral in practice. It was selectively involved, not for conquest, but for preservation. And yet some files remain classified. Why? Because they do not just reveal what happened, they reveal how modern power works. Consider this. The CIA's use of non-governmental organizations, humanitarian fronts, and cultural influence campaigns during the Cold War mirror Vatican methods tested during World War II. Influence without invasion, control without occupation. Even today, this strategy remains alive. The Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with over 180 countries. It holds observer status at the United Nations. It influences elections, peace talks, and humanitarian corridors. And the United States still listens, not because of armies, but because of reach. When Pope John Paul II supported the Solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s, the CIA quietly coordinated. Declassified records later confirmed that American intelligence and the Vatican shared assessments, timing, and strategy. Communism collapsed soon after. Coincidence or culmination? This moment traced its roots back to Rome, 1941, when a Protestant American president and a Catholic pope chose secrecy over spectacle. But history judges harshly. Some ask, did silence enable evil? Did strategy excuse injustice? Did survival justify moral compromise? There are no simple answers, only consequences. Millions were saved. Some criminals escaped justice. Faith endured. Truth became fragmented. And perhaps that is why this story still unsettles governments, scholars, and believers alike. Because it forces one terrifying realization, that the most powerful agreements in history are not signed with pens. They are made in silence, and once made, they never truly end. If you watched this entire series, you are now among the few who know this hidden chapter of history. Like this video, comment what stayed with you, share it so others can learn, and subscribe to the channel, because real history deserves real attention. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's guarded by the faithful and protected by the powerful.